FDA podcast on democracy in Venezuela. This podcast is the second in a series on Venezuela. The first podcast was by Dr. Maria Victor, which is available on democracychange.org. I am Stephen Garvey, Executive Director of the Foundation for Democratic Advancement. Today I will be talking to Mr. Leonardo Tovar. Mr. Tovar is a Venezuelan expatriate living out of Toronto, Canada. He has a university background in political science and economics, and he is undertaking a master's in public policy. Also, Mr. Tovar lived in Venezuela up to the age of 17. Welcome, Mr. Tovar, to FDA Podcast.
Thanks for having me here, Steven.
Could you tell me a bit about your background in terms of, the last time you were there? Like, were you there during the coup in 2002, and how often do you visit?
Sure. Like you said, I'm a Venezuelan who now calls Canada home since 2004. That was just about the time when things started to get a little bit rough there in terms of economic and political unrest. I was there in 2002 when there was a general strike that pretty much paralyzed the whole country for over 30 days. And prior to that, it was when, they had the April 2001 coup d'etat where Chavez was ousted for 2 days. I wasn't in the country at the time, but from, what my family said and, things that, it wasn't pretty. There was a lot of uncertainty. People were fearing for, their personal safety. All the freedoms and guarantees were written off by the temporary government, so people pretty much didn't know what was going to happen. When I was there in 2002, December 2002, that's when the big Chamber of Commerce of Venezuela organized a general strike to pretty much paralyze the whole economic engine of the country and put some pressure on Chavez to resign. That went on for about a month, and I remember clearly, being there. No stores will open. There was actually no economic life whatsoever. After 15 days or so, we started seeing a lot of scarcity. There was no food on the supermarkets, nothing on, bakeries. You had to line up to go to, fill up your gas tank, and it was not. The way they handled it, it wasn't that well organized from the top, and it was just in the middle of Christmas break, and people were starting to see the consequences of not having any economic dynamic in the country, and Chavez was not resigning. Then there was some violence there, and I clearly remember I was 14 at the time. My mom wouldn't let me, go out on the streets, and there was a lot of there was a lot of fear for our lives at that time. So, as you know now, Chavez never resigned after the general strike, and freedoms and rights were much more, were further restricted after that. That's why you get a lot of. Have you heard of the term expedeveceros? Yeah, it's basically all the people that was fired from the oil, the national oil company that we have, PDVSA.
Yes.
And people started being persecuted because of they joining the movement of the general strike, and that's when things got went totally south after that.
Who were you fearing?
We were feeling. Well, first of all, I was living in a small town, so it wasn't, any of those big cities where you see on the news, where most of the political action happened. I was in one of those towns. But again, it's just that fear that, you never know whether or not the government's going to come down. It's like, I would like to, sometimes I think of, what's going on right now in Libya. We didn't have any bombs, we didn't have any, rebels fighting on the streets. But it was kind of like the same uncertainty. Is the government going to come down? Is it not? what would happen if it doesn't come down? What are the rights and freedoms, and how are we gonna be after such a revolution, and with a government that knows that some people turn their back onto him. So it's kind of like that fear, right? You don't know whether you should support one cause, or you should stick to the ruler in place at that time.
Right.
So
Could you talk about the conservative regime that was in power for 40 years before Chavez?
sure.
Because there's
First
been
of
a
all,
lot of criticism of that regime
right.
in terms of being almost a police state. There was a lot of deaths during that time.
Yeah. Well, I've done some research on this, and basically, Chavez is just not a phenomenon that just came out of the blue. It was actually something. It's just pretty much the consequence of years and years of governments that were not attending to the needs of Venezuelans. Let's remind ourselves that Venezuela is one of the top 10 exporters of petroleum in the world. It's got the second largest reserve of oil as we speak right now, after Canada and its oil sands. It is certainly a country that is very wealthy in terms of minerals, and it's been like that for over, at least 8 or 7 decades. So during the 1950s, we have a very tough, iron fist dictatorship that lasted for 10 years after, and that was the rule of General Marcos Pérez Jiménez. And after Jiménez was ousted, we had 40 years of what they call our, democratic period, and that's when, what you just said, it was pretty much a right-wing subsequent governments that pretty much instituted different rules that were not benefiting all Venezuelans as a whole. This is the time also when we have the oil spikes from the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very heartfelt, especially in the states. But in Venezuela, that was a time of big bonanza, right? Price of oil were skyrocketing, and there was a lot of money all of the sudden. So you could expect what governments with weak institutions would do with a lot of revenues coming into their hands. That's when you see the rise of corruption in Venezuela. Venezuela, my parents originally immigrated from Colombia to Venezuela, and that was, during the boom times of the 70s and the 80s. And they tell me that it was, there was a lot of work for everyone. There was a lot of easy credit. There was a lot of, economic dynamic going on back at the time, but that's when the corruption is starting to take its roots in the Venezuelan culture, and it just exploded. It wasn't controlled back then, and it just led to what we, to a phenomenon right now that we know as, the Bolivarian Revolution. Just,
Yeah.
A pushback against that big corruption that was harvested during the 70s and 80s.
Interesting. They say the I read one statistic, and it said people living in poverty was close to 80%.
Right, and that's been always kind of like the slogan of why is Venezuela the way it is. We have such vast wealth in terms of minerals, and also in in terms of revenues. We get a lot of gold stacks, and but why do we still have a population? 80% of our population in poverty. I think it was 50% of the population, in dire needs. Like living below the poverty, extreme poverty line. Why do we have such a high such a high income inequality in our country? And it all comes down to the fact that we have weak institutions and poor leadership at the top.
Right. Interesting. So, can you touch on the Bolivarian Revolution, what that means to you, and where you think it's going? Because you said
Well,
it was a reaction to the conservative rule there for so long.
right. Now, when we talk about this conservative rule, Venezuela before Chavez, it wasn't completely, a totally. It was not like a full capitalistic society, that we like to think, or that Chavez likes us to think that it was. It's not that previous governments were, uh, all to, like, how would I frame it? It was not as right wing as we like to think. Before Chavez came, there was a lot of investment in education. I believe it was up to 5% of GDP was being invested in education, healthcare. It's universal. There's this universal healthcare room for private healthcare providers, and healthcare was pretty much distributed equitable across the different socioeconomic groups. There was certainly a lot of programs that were universal, so it was not conservative rule in the way that we see, say, in the States, where we have, where people have to buy healthcare insurance, or, where they will have to pay for their education. Certainly, there were a lot of things that were provided by the state.
Right.
So basically, I think that what the Bolivarian Revolution actually did was to provide a framework to improve the services that were already provided by the state. And here I'm talking not only about healthcare and education, but I'm also talking about public housing. I'm talking about better economic policy and better economic standards in terms of minimum wage, better economic opportunities for everyone as a whole. And that caught on with Venezuelans, especially that 80% under the poverty line. They really thought that they found someone who would actually live their concerns and something about it. Now, Chavez has been in power already for over a decade, and some of the key indicators show that nothing towards that end has actually been achieved. Now we see, certainly, there's been a lot of economic growth, this high rates of consumption in North America, where it was good for commodity prices, but it seems like there's been a lot of public work done, very little investment in education and healthcare, and those are the two areas that I'm very interested in. And as a policy analyst in training, I'm always looking, what those two areas are, spending in those two areas are, as opposed to spending in other things. Chavez has been good at spending, in defense, helping our military force. He's been also good at spending on our oil industry, also trying to improve it to a certain extent. Other than that, education right now is less than 1% of the GDP. Healthcare, it's also been declining over the last decade. Over the last couple of years, there's been a huge need for more infrastructure spending, especially in the area of electricity and power production. So here we see where the Bolivarian Revolution is kind of like has gone wrong. The services that the population was expecting to have improved, but not at the same rate that one would expect, given the economic growth that we have seen over the last decade.
What about, because I know Chavez, through the Bolivarian Revolution, has empowered a lot of the poorer classes of people, the people who are uneducated, the people who are at the lower echelons of the economy?
Right. There have been some very successful programs, such as the improving literacy rate in Venezuela, especially among, like you said, people in the lower echelons of society. I think our literacy rate now in Venezuela is, upwards of the 95%. But having people that read and write, almost, it's good, but it's not the same as having, a lot of a lot of people going to university and going pursuing post-secondary degrees. What we're seeing right now is Venezuela. If you want to understand how Venezuela and the dynamics of the Venezuelan economy is going, you gotta also look at its demographic trend. Venezuela is one of the it's got about 40% or 50% of its population is between the age of 14 and 44 years old. Now, if you look at it compared to other countries, especially developed countries, Venezuela is pretty much a very young state. It's got a very young population. If that population is not actively and productively working, you can see that it's just been there's a lot of wasted resources there. There's a lot of idle resources. Like I said, there's been little investment in education and healthcare, and although this cohort of the population is not a big consumer of healthcare, they are nevertheless a big consumer of education.
Okay. What about humanism? What impact is that having?
On humanism?
Yeah, the whole ideology of that. Humanism. That's a big part of the Bolivarian movement.
Right, and I'm pretty sure you have come across some numbers that say that when with Chavez in power, there's been a drop in poverty rate.
Yeah.
And we should give credit to Chavez for that. But then again, we should not forget that over the last decade we've seen also one of the highest economic growth of the country. I'm just not sure how I will phrase this, but it's definitely it's also doing part to just because we have such a big economic growth over the last decade. We also seen a lot of people being pulled out of poverty. Nowadays, you're talking about a humanism. It's basically whether or not people are better off by of course they're not in poverty anymore, but are they actually better off in other aspects, such as do they feel confident of the future? Do they think that there's opportunity for them lying in the future? Is there social mobility, vertically and horizontally? Do they see themselves contributing to a country that will give them back something in the future? Right now in Venezuela, to answer these questions, right now in Venezuela what we're seeing is a big change of a society that is going from society that was pacific and very collegial, very friendly, to a society that I've seen going slightly more like much more violent. There is high crime rates, and they've been skyrocketing for the last 10 years. There is a lot of the justice system in Venezuela seems to only be working when it actually has a political goal and not for anything else. Right now, there's some reforms that Chavez has introduced to the penal code, and those reforms are actually being to the detriment of the society. To just give you an example, people no longer, if you are not caught committing a crime, chances for you to be convicted of that crime is going to be very slim. The reason for that is that they have catch you in flagrancy, and when you don't have enough witnesses, and when you don't have a penal code that motivates you or makes you afraid of the consequences of committing a crime, you're going to see a proliferation of crimes.
But that's the same as in Canada, for example, right?
Right, we can see that, and it's so those reforms were introduced very early into the first Chavez term. Right now, we're seeing the consequences of that. People are starting to arm themselves. They just they think that it's just too dangerous out there, and they all need to have carry a gun with them. Right now, disputes and problems are often solved with guns. And when you see a society that is arming itself, and where people are, not trusting each other anymore, we see a lot of violence coming up.
Right.
So
Do you think there's other factors that are causing this violence, this disconnection in society?
definitely, there's a lot of polarization also that has come in with Chavez. That was one of the main criticisms of Chavez in the Venezuelan side, and that is that before that, before Chavez came, people, were not so against each other as we see now. It seems like it's a class warfare right now. It is, them versus us, as opposed to, we are all Venezuelans. And what that has created is that, that animosity usually ends up being resolved with violence. And when you have, people with arms, that violence can turn bloody, right?
Right. What about there's foreign governments interfering in Venezuela, right?
Foreign governments interfere in Venezuela?
Yeah, through funding opposition, funding students, that type of thing. Do you think that would be contributing to the polarization of the society?
Hear that just some rumors around, and usually most of the rumors are spread by Chavez, who, pretty much felt that everything that's going on in Venezuela is it's coming from the, the opposition, and the reason they're being successful is that they're being, foreign, and it's just a way to push the blame or to, put a small screen and hide all these other social issues that she has.
Right, it is going on, right? It was just uncovered that the Spanish government was just this last year funded $5 million to one of the opposition parties.
Right.
And also the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy. It's there's been a lot of work uncovering a lot of funding over the years, and it's still going on, right?
Right.
So these are opposition elements.
Right. And you're saying that they are somehow linked to this violence?
Well, couldn't they be contributing to the disconnection in society where you got opposing forces?
I mean, I don't see opposition as something that is bad for society. I think what is lacking in Venezuela is a true debate about, social issues that affect all Venezuelans as a whole. It shouldn't be a polarized debate on where, we're only going to focus on one sector of the population, and the other sector of the population is always going to suffer.
Yeah.
It shouldn't. There's certainly a need for political leadership from both sides to come to terms and start discussing about what really matters to all Venezuelans. And one of those, I think the population is starting to see that, and they're starting to demand for something like that. One of the things that actually affected all Venezuelans as a whole, that never discriminated, against classes or regional sectors, was about 2 years ago there was, a lot of blackouts and brownouts due to lack of investment in the power generation.
Mhm.
And there was also some water shortages across the country, and that actually, I think, awoke the population to make, to understand that there are some issues that, affect them all, and that should be dealt by both sides of the, the political spectrum. It's just not a matter of whether, you're part of the revolution or you're against the revolution. There are some issues, and the population, I tried to send that message through the 2010 elections, right? The
Yes.
National Assembly, where, you saw that it was a very heated a competition between those two fractions. So sure enough, there is a lot of foreign government intervention from the opposition. I would also, argue that there is also a lot of foreign government intervention from, Chavez side. I think the biggest one would be the Cuban government, getting into a lot of domestic affairs. Now they don't do it; they do it, behind the scenes. But yes, nevertheless, they're still there. It's, and you're not surprised to know that Chavez also has a lot of, policy advisors that are, coming from the Castro regime. Chavez himself, he goes there for consultations on different policy debates. He goes to Cuba for consultation on different policy debates. So, we don't see that type of criticism from Chavez, from going abroad and having all this type of, consultations with foreign leaders, but we do always see that from the opposition side, right?
Right. What impact does Simon Bolivar have in this in the Bolivarian Revolution?
Simon Bolivar, it's the thing about this revolution is that Simon Bolivar, he was very cautious of any type of, he liberated Venezuela 4 times. So by the end of it, he was he wanted to be very cautious of foreign, not intervention, but another foreign invasion or okay. Let me rephrase that again. He liberated Venezuela 4 times. He liberated, and each time the Spaniards will come back and regain Venezuela. It was a strategic place for the Spanish Empire in South America. So that's why he went on and liberated, he went south and started liberating Colombia and Ecuador and Peru to make sure that all the Spaniards were expelled from the country. His ideology pretty much reflects that. He's always wary about, a foreign intervention, a future invasion from another imperialist power. And you see that in his writings. Chavez has taken that idea of, it's Venezuelan first, sovereignty first. We're always thinking of that, external threat. And he has extrapolated that idea and, pretty much packages in a nice, framework tied with a little bit of Cuban communism. And he calls it now the Bolivarian Revolution. I think he does a disservice to Bolivar himself by always referring to him as if all his policy solutions somehow would have been approved by Bolivar. Chavez, he likes to, whenever he has a very polemical or very controversial policy in mind or something, he likes to point to the fact that, it goes back to, historical roots of Venezuelans, and Bolivar would thought about this, but it never went through because of different political, different political tensions back at the time. However, he's going to introduce that type of policy now because it's just what Venezuela needs, and I'm not sure if I'm making sense in this way, but it's just a nice scapegoat that he uses.
He is elected, right?
Oh, we're talking about Chavez, or
yes, Chavez.
Yeah.
So, and it's unlike the conservatives in Canada who only got 39.6% of the vote. Chavez is getting in the 50 percentile.
Right.
So he's got over an absolute majority of the support of the people there, right?
Right.
So he is entitled to a voice, at least democratically, right?
Yes. Yes.
In terms of leadership, I guess. So what I'm wondering is how to bridge this opposition. Like, do you think the real issue is with the opposition, that they're not respecting the democratic system there?
I would argue the opposite. The real issue here is that Chavez doesn't allow the opposition to sit on the table and have a frank discussion about policy issues. It's a very poisonous environment right now. I was just reading, this week that the Supreme Court is not going to allow the main leader of the opposition to stand against Chavez in the next presidential elections due to under some very shady premises, right? It seems like Chavez is determined to gain power via non-democratic means. But still win an election. So I don't think the opposition in this issue that we're talking about is the root of the problem. I would argue that it's Chavez.
Yeah, but doesn't the opposition has access to private radio and TV? They're also part of the National Assembly, so they definitely have forums where they can voice themselves.
Definitely. But here's the thing. They do have access to, national radios and TVs. However, that access has been restricted. It now comes down to one TV station, and they're being fined to a point where, it's pretty much trying to squeeze their, trying to make them go out of business just by giving them fines about everything that they say on TV just because it's not to the government's liking.
Yeah.
The other thing is, sure, they are part of the National Assembly, but again, party discipline, in Venezuela is very strict and is very tight. It's just much like party discipline here in Canada. So Chavez still has a majority in the National Assembly, and whenever he introduces a bill, it's not discussed or debated, or whether or not there are some issues. They don't amend the bills that Chavez introduced, pretty much what I'm trying to say.
But they do the same here, where the conservatives have a majority, right?
Right.
And they have control of, they're getting control, well, they actually have control of the Senate, and now they're getting control of the Supreme Court as well.
Right. And now you can see, that there's been a lot of criticism for that, right?
Right.
You see, a lot of op-eds and, editorials here in Canada.
Right.
They don't like that such a tight grip, by the conservatives. Now, in Venezuela, what we're seeing, and here, let's not try to compare too much, Venezuela and Canada, because it's kind of like comparing two different political systems, right?
Right.
But I would say, what we're seeing is in Venezuela, we have a very strong executive. We have a very weak legislative body, the National Assembly, and the Supreme Court is also very weak. So when you have such a big imbalance of power, and it's all concentrated, in one person, you can see how it is very difficult to let go of that position, and that's what I think it's facing. It gives us that position of so much power, and if the opposition comes in and say he gains, he wins the election next year, it's going to happen the same to the opposition, right? So much power concentrated. So maybe what I'd like to take out from this is basically it's just the way that the institutions in Venezuela are set up don't give enough room for a healthy debate about policy, about the issues that matter to people, as we would like to see. And that is basically my main criticism, that in Venezuela there's a lack of political leadership to have policy debates about what matters to Venezuelans as a whole.
How would Venezuela progress towards something like that?
Definitely, it will need, like I said, political leadership. We have a unicameral legislative body. We only have a National Assembly, not unlike Canada, where we have the Senate and the House of Commons. But I would like to perhaps see a more independent legislative body, much like it is in the States, where we have, the States is the complete opposite. They have a very strong Congress and a very weak president. Venezuela is a very strong president and a very weak National Assembly. If we somehow could make sure the National Assembly has much more powers in their hands, they can actually introduce bills and approve it and amend it themselves. They could clean up a little bit of the party discipline that they have. Make sure that their backbenchers in the National Assembly or senior the senior deputies in the National Assembly have a voice, and they can actually work out in bipartisan committees. I think that's one way we can progress. But having a polarized National Assembly, it just polarizes the whole society as a whole.
Right. Very interesting. With the stuff going on in Libya, one could argue that was just centered on getting access to oil. And same with Iraq.
Right.
So, does that make you worry about Venezuela with its oil deposits? That it may get embroiled in some kind of foreign conflict that's kind of posed from the outside?
So let me see if I can understand your question correctly. Am I worried about Venezuela going into what just happened in Libya and Iraq, kind of like following what happened in Libya and Iraq? Would that be?
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to, but not, obviously it'd be a different situation, but some kind of foreign intervention where the oil was seized through change of political governance
Right.
and basically a puppet government installed.
Right. I've thought about this question a lot. If we have a change in government, are we gonna go back to the same type of government that we had before Chavez? Is that gonna be necessarily good? The second question is no, it's not gonna be necessarily good if we have a regime just like the one that was before Chavez. Like I said before, the regime that was before Chavez had its flaw, and it was very catered to a sector of the population that pretty much forgot about people at the bottom. The government that we have right now is trying to polarize society, and what that has accomplished also is that it has made Venezuelans much more aware of their rights and freedom. It has made Venezuela much more aware of what type of political system they want to have. It has made them think twice about someone that comes in promising heaven and earth and not actually being able to fulfill it. So if we go hypothetically, like you said, are we going to have a puppet government that is just going to serve the interests of foreign interests, and especially oil and oil companies? I don't think so. But here's the thing, and here's a big but. Venezuela depends a lot on its oil industry. I can't remember the numbers correctly now, but I think it was about 80% or more of our exports last year was petroleum. A lot of FDI, foreign direct investment comes through thanks to our oil industry. It's a main part. I think it also employs a lot of the professional class in Venezuela. So we always, and since we cannot consume it all, we have to export it. And once you start exporting it, we're always going to have to deal with foreign interests, and we're always going to try to see how we can balance their interests with our interests. So I think any government that comes after Chavez has to go through the same thing that Chavez is going right now, which is how do I act strong against the United States, but at the same time I know that they're the one paying for our bills, right?
Right. Interesting. So earlier you feel that the Chavez government should be doing more in terms of education?
Right.
What about healthcare? Are you satisfied with his healthcare initiatives? I know he's brought a lot of Cuban doctors in, basically
Right.
because he said there's not enough trained Venezuelan doctors to help attend to the health of the population.
Right. Interestingly enough, he has done at the grassroots level. He has done a lot of healthcare initiatives. But what Venezuela might be is much more like an overhaul of the whole healthcare system. Like I said at the beginning, we have a two-tier system, private and public. Seems like the government has pretty much tried to cut the funding to the public sector and push people onto going and acquire healthcare via through the private way. And that was not the case at least 15 years ago. Public hospitals were very respected in Venezuela 15 years ago. And, the lack of funding and pretty much, a lack of leadership in that area too has led it to, the state that it is right now. Now, he did bring in Cuban doctors, and he was sending it to rural areas and places where there was not healthcare services before that. But yet again, that's another area that has become right now very criticized because of its corruption that are going through there. These Cuban doctors, there's been studied that they're actually being paid more than a Venezuelan doctor will be paid. That Venezuelan doctors coming from universities are not allowed to, start their practices in these rural areas because they're being non-employed by Cuban doctors. So it seems like it's a good social program, but at the same time it's being also used for political gains, and it's not doing what it was intended to do, right?
Well, apparently there's a lot of they're treating a lot of Venezuelans in rural areas.
Right, and I'm not against that. I'm completely. I think that's the way we should go forward. But the way they're doing it is pretty much like in an ad hoc manner. We set up walking clinic here, and we'll come back. And they pretty much do a tour around, rural areas, right? As opposed to, thinking long term and start, set up walking clinics, actual buildings in those rural areas to serve people that are being underserved by the healthcare sector.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything about some kind of psychological warfare going on in Venezuela?
The psychological warfare?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of, how polarized things are and,
But also sabotage of, let's say, like a electricity plant, railway tracks, that type of thing?
Sabotage? In what way? No, I'm not sure what
yeah, I've heard some reports on that. I haven't got any concrete evidence of it. There's just people speculating that it's some kind of way to undermine the Chavez government by making it look bad.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I haven't, only other than rumors, I haven't heard anything like that.
It's hard to prove that, is it?
Right, it is hard to prove that, and I think that if it's just a sabotage campaign, it's not a smart way to do things, to do politics.
Right.
It's going to bite them back at the end if they are, caught by the government doing it, or, they are exposed by the media. And then again, it just goes back to the way some things are done in Venezuela. It's just people like to use scapegoats to distract the population from sitting down and talking about, the social policy issues that are, a concern for all of them. It just seems like they're just way too creative to come up with things on how to divert the attention from the things that really matter to all Venezuelans, right?
Like the war on terror in the U.S.?
Kind of, you would say, yeah, it's a small things that they create.
Fear.
And that way people, they install fear, or they install, hatred. There's a lot of hatred that has come out, just with the social polarization. There are people that, you can see that they hate Chavez with their guts. And, and there are other people that love him, and, they just cry anytime, they say, anytime he comes out from a chemotherapy session or something like that. So, that type of emotion, there's that big emotional pull that I think, in my belief, distracts people from, thinking rationally, being able to criticize, either the government or the opposition rationally, and, sit down, talk about what the issues are.
Right. What do you foresee for the future of Venezuela?
First of all, I see that there are different things that I'm seeing, and I don't know, maybe I have a kind of like a half glass view of things, but I'm not very optimistic of what the future of Venezuela. Whether we see a third term of Chavez regime or a first term of an opposition rule, it's not going to be pretty when they are faced in 2013. With such a big, they are running budget deficits right now. Since we depend so much in petroleum and our oil exports, there are not good forecasts of our global economy. And if the West is not consuming, Venezuelans are going to suffer because they're not going to see their oil being bought as much, right?
Yes.
So, and we are right now experiencing 30% of inflation rate annually. We are experiencing high rates of crime. We are experiencing also like higher unemployment, like in the 20%, especially for younger people, which are like I said before, it's a big fraction of the Venezuelan population. So basically, any government that comes in, it's gonna have to come in with a very bold policy idea on how to get Venezuela moving again. It's gonna have to show some very strong political leadership skills, and it's just gonna need to learn how to work with both sides of the political spectrum. You can no longer have a polarized society with a polarized political environment. You have to work with both sides of the spectrum. You can no longer think about benefiting one sector of the population over another. You have to think of how to get every sector of moving.
It takes both sides.
It does take both sides, and it takes a lot of political will.
But, if the opposition is being funded by the U.S. government, Spanish government, the UK government, the Canadian government, maybe that's eroding their incentive to get along, because they're hoping that, that somehow they can get back in power and not have to deal with Chavez and his people.
Yeah, but then again, like I said before, people right now are much more aware of who their political leaders are, and they're going to scrutinize them a lot. I just hope, just like they're criticizing Chavez on, day in and day out, they're going to start criticizing whoever comes in power, and that type of scrutiny is gonna hopefully deter people that have double intentions from getting to the top.
I see. Okay, thank you, Mr. Tovar, for sharing your insights on Venezuela. For more FDA podcasts, please visit democracychange.org or iTunes podcasts under the